Well, hello, everyone. I am Rick Welch, and I am here in this StreamYard studio with Michael Sullivan, Zach Davis, Joel Rosenauer, and Travis Drum. Hello, all you.
Hello.
What's up,
Hey,
Rick?
Rick.
So, we've been talking together about this, doing a study in Revelation. Mike and I started one with Joel probably about a year ago, and then we all had other things. And I think it's been about a year, and we started it, and then that was it. I think we did one episode, and then we got all really busy. But what I want to do is I want to look at this book in total. I see a lot of studies where we get portions of this book, and much like the way David Chilton took us through the days of vengeance and was just one of the most amazing books, I want to discuss it. I want to discuss this book from start to finish from the fulfilled perspective, which is the perspective that all of us have. But one of the biggest things that I want to start with in this introduction to Revelation is the idea of when this book was dated. Now, I've heard that it was dated 96 AD, 98 AD. And basically it's because of Irenaeus of Lyon, a quote, I think, that he writes in a book. It's been used multiple times. That may not be the only one. That's the only one I really know of. But I wanted to ask you all about the internal evidence that we can find in Revelation that could show us that it could be earlier than the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Does anybody want to take the lead on that one?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I'll start with probably a non-exegetical one, but it's still an internal argument, and that's the argument from silence. You know, if we were doing a documentary on Manhattan in New York, and it was like a 2-hour in-depth documentary, but we didn't discuss the Twin Towers or 9/11, people would just assume. I mean, if they got this video like 50 years from now, they would assume, oh, this was written before 9/11, right? And you have this internal conflict in the New Testament between the Christians and the Pharisees, the Jews according to the flesh, as to who would be the children of God, and the Judaizers, and all of this conflict. Well, AD 70 solves that debate, right? Mm-hmm. And we have all these Old Testament prophecies that are anticipating the judgment of Jerusalem and the second temple. And if this was written after AD 70, we would have that virtually on every page as kind of like a victory dance. But no, we have these events that were imminent. So that's why that's one of the main reasons. It's an argument from silence. And there's a lot of good exegetical ones, but I'll leave that for my friends here.
I'm just thinking off of what you said, Mike, and I know the last name was Robinson. He was kind of a liberal scholar, but is it JT?
Yes, sir.
Anyway,
it is. Hang on. It is. I've got his name here. It is.
It was in my head, and then it kind of left. But
yeah, I know who you're talking about. He was a liberal scholar, and most liberal scholars place all the dating of prophetic events after the event because they want to get rid of the miraculous. But yet he was one who admitted, hey, you know, the silence here is deafening,
right?
And so he gave a pre-AD 70 date to Revelation as well, and he's a liberal. So that's how powerful this argument is when you actually turn a liberal to your position.
Yeah.
You know, something that I think about in this whole discussion is, and granted, I'll give this, you all four of you probably know the book of Revelation better than I do. But there are certain elements and events and things in there that stick out that I really have a hard time, I guess, kind of coming to a conclusion on what that could possibly be if it was a late date. And so one example I'll give you, I think it's Luke 23. When Jesus is on the way to the cross and those women are wailing and weeping, and he says, don't weep for me, weep for you and your children, because the day is coming when you're going to cry out to the mountains, fall on me, and, you know, the rocks crush me or hide me, loose paraphrase there. Well, you get to Revelation, is it 6, I think?
Yes. Yep.
Toward the end of Revelation 6, and you see that exact thing happening. Well, I mean, I guess it's possible that that could have happened in the 90s or so forth. But if that's the case, then what event is that talking about that could fulfill that? And it's just like Luke 21 in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse. Jesus is talking about how the city is going to be trampled by the nations until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Well, Revelation 11, the city is going to be trampled or trodden underfoot by the Gentiles for 42 months, which is tethered back to Daniel's times, and half a times. And so again, and especially in Luke's context, that's directly related to when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, which is leading up to the events of 70 AD. So in my mind, I don't know, just those two examples, I don't know how you reconcile those with the late date view, unless you obviously posit the whole thing to be in the future, which is, well, I'll be nice.
Yeah. Well, this along those lines too, and there are some, really specific passages too, that I've gotten, you guys have, that we can get to, but just in a more general sense, since we're kind of doing this as an introduction, I've heard a lot, and maybe you guys have too, or maybe our listeners as well, if a revelation is actually later, that destroys a fulfilled view, that destroys preterism. And what I would say is it does more than that. It destroys almost the inspiration of Scripture, because what event would be around that time if it was written later? And then you'd have Revelation being an outlier that sort of had nothing to do with the rest of the Bible. So I think if Revelation is not written in an earlier day, we have a much bigger problem than preterism being destroyed. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And also the book of Revelation is John's version of the Olivet Discourse, kind of piggybacking off of what Travis said. So they're both anticipating something imminent. That's the fall of Jerusalem and the temple.
Yeah.
I think the same thing as far as the nature of things, and that it's dictated and necessary. You look at Leviticus chapter 26, and it's all a covenantal judgment. And everything that's in Leviticus 26, you have 3 sets of 7-fold judgments that are coming. All of these things, such as the plague, such as being destroyed by sword, such as foreign armies coming in, such as pestilence, such as famine. You look at Revelation 6, you see all this stuff. All of these are covenantal cursings that are coming upon God's covenant people under this old covenant system. And I was explaining preterism to somebody that had never heard of it 2 nights ago. And I just asked him without any context. I said, is the old covenant still around? He said, no, absolutely not. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole point as to where we would come from and say, well, it couldn't pass away until it was all fulfilled per Matthew 5:17 and 18. Therefore, if all of these are covenantal judgments, then this can't happen in mine in your future. It has to be something in the past. And if it's written after AD 70, then you have absolutely no basis for anything in this. And I'll just give you another one while I'm speaking. And I think probably the biggest and most obvious, clearest thing for me in the book of Revelation is who Babylon the harlot is, and that it's old covenant Israel, and that she would be judged in their generation for killing the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. And if she's judged in Revelation 18 as Babylon the harlot, it coincides perfectly with Revelation 2:9 and 3:9 when it says that they claim that they were Jews, but were actually a synagogue of Satan. And that's exactly who that is pertaining to the old covenant system again. So you don't have anybody to pin that on in the future. There's nobody else in history ever that could be Babylon the harlot. So this judgment can't be in my or your future. It had to be in the future of the writer of Revelation, soon to take place, who'd be crushed under their feet. And it only leaves you one option. So that's 2 internal evidences for me, that it's a covenantal lawsuit and who the harlot has to be.
And Zach, I would tether what you just said directly back to Isaiah's little apocalypse, Isaiah 24 through 27, and you read passages. Well, death is swallowed up. The wedding supper happens. All these eschatological events occur when the fortified city is made desolate, when the altars are turned to chalkstone, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if that coincides with the book of Revelation, and that wasn't fulfilled in AD 70, then again, the question to beg is, well, what could it have been? Because obviously those people were destroyed. Those events happened. So if you don't take an early date, there is a major disconnect that you have to deal with.
All right, let's be general and generic again. If in Acts 24 and Acts 26, Paul says that he teaches nothing other than what's found in the law and the prophets in the Old Testament, then go find me an Old Testament prophetic text that points you past AD 70. There's another problem.
Yeah. And what Travis said about Isaiah's little apocalypse there in Isaiah 24, that the whole thing begins by Israel breaking the old covenant law, which goes exactly what what you're talking about, Zach, and it's covenant contrasts and covenant curses. Luther didn't understand why the book of Revelation should be in the New Testament. He said that it doesn't correspond with the rest of the New Testament epistles. But here's the thing that he was missing. Other than the time text and how it's referring to an imminent judgment upon Jerusalem, where he really missed it is what Zach was talking about. The construction of Revelation is a covenantal contrast. When you understand that this is a tale of two cities, which is a tale of two wives, one to be divorced, the old covenant bride, Jerusalem, and the marriage of the new covenant, now it opens up a whole new realm when you're looking at Galatians, when you're looking at Hebrews, where you have the covenantal contrast just about everywhere in the New Testament. And behold, Revelation has it in abundance. Once you see that covenantal contrast taking place in Revelation, that's just another key that really helps it unfold right before your eyes.
Yeah, you've got one thing I've done sometimes is you've got kind of along those lines, you've got Revelation 21, where it talks about the New Jerusalem coming down as identified as a bride. And if you ask most believers, are we the bride of Christ now? They would say yes. That's only possible with a fulfilled view.
That's right.
Jeremiah 31, the promise of a new covenant. And though they broke the covenant, though she was a bride to him. I mean, that's your whole contrast. So.
And obviously, we can't get away from the words of Daniel and the removal of the sanctuary in the city and how important that is. And that's all of that seems to be covered. That all this incredible judgment that's coming on Israel. There's been a lot of people that talk about this in the future way, and they play these games with all of these different countries. We know what's going on right now. Talking about Gog and Magog. It was just recent with Tucker Carlson and Glenn Beck. It's more of this stuff. Max Lucado's got a book out on Bible of all people. Max Lucado now has a book on Bible prophecy. So it's a never-ending circus that definitely wears me out. The only internal evidence that I can bring that I really know of for myself, besides what you said, is the part about measuring the temple, which whenever John is to go measure that temple, the temple was there. And now if that was just a vision, fine, but it seemed that he told him to go and measure the temple, right? The existing temple.
Well, it's symbolic. And,
right.
and the Greek word for temple that he's to measure is naos. It is used of the most holy place. Sometimes it refers to the entire temple structure. But in the book of Revelation itself, every time it's used, last time I studied it, it's referring to the most holy place. So he measures the most holy place. Now, measuring in Scripture can be a sign of judgment or protection. And in that context, in Revelation 11, it is for protection. He is measuring the most holy place. That is symbolic of the church, the new covenant bride worshipers. The rest, the holy place, the court of the Gentiles, Jerusalem, all of that would be trodden down for 3.5 years by the Gentile nations, Rome. And of course, like Travis said, you go to Luke 21:24, and you have it's the times of the Gentiles. What are the times of the Gentiles? Oh, that 3.5 years, the 3.5 years of the war, Daniel 9:26 and 27, that's then recapitulated again in Daniel chapter 12 for 3.5 years when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. And Daniel uses the Greek there in the Septuagint, the appointed time, both in Daniel 9 and Daniel 12, and he connects the appointed time with those 3.5 years. So in Revelation 11, look at verse 18. When Jerusalem is judged, where the Lord was slain, that's Old Covenant Jerusalem, in verse 18, he uses kairos. It's the appointed time for the dead to be judged. The only other place the appointed time is used in the Old Testament, Daniel 9, Daniel 12. And I have his book, Wilson's commentary on Revelation, and he doesn't touch the 3.5 years as far as it being in Daniel, because he knows it would lock him into Daniel chapter 12 and the resurrection being fulfilled. And that's a whole nother thing. But it is the measuring of the most holy place, the church. And this is symbolic, but still, he's calling them to measure the temple, which in their minds would be symbolic, but it's still standing. So it has to be standing for the symbolism to even work, really.
Well, that points you to the same thing, what you're talking about in Revelation 11:18 right there, and toward the end of it, that chapter, because it says at that time the kingdom of God was open in heaven. So that's when your New Jerusalem, the part that's left, is inherited when the outer city is destroyed. You've got rid of the sea, you've got rid of the outer shell of it. Now what's left is the Holy of Holies and the new covenant, and that's that new covenant bride, which is the same picture that points you back to 21, who comes down. That's Revelation 11:18. They're similar in that, because she inherits and comes down at that time that the old one's destroyed. If that's not pre-70 AD, then this isn't just a timing issue. You've got a whole nature issue of things that can't be reconciled. So it's not just that they missed the timing. We've whiffed on the nature of all this stuff as well. And that's why it's such a free-for-all.
Yeah.
I thought of something as Rick was talking about, was the temple existing or not. It's just went and popped in my head, something that I learned from Mike, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 years ago. But in Revelation 16, it says that the angel poured out his 7th bowl, and a voice came out of the temple essentially saying it is done. And it goes on to say that they were hurling these 100-pound stones into the temple, into the city. Well, Flavius Josephus, sure enough, he records that in that siege, and that, the leading up to the destruction in AD 70, they were flinging 100-pound stones into the thing, and actually records that some of the people were crying out, "The Son cometh." Yeah. So there was at least some concept of recognition among those guys. They knew what was going on. But again, it begs the question that if Josephus records that specific, line there in Revelation 16, and I'm not saying he was saying this is that, but obviously we would, right? John said this would happen, and then Josephus records that it did. If Revelation 16 is post AD 70, where does that fit in? I mean, what do you do with that?
Right. One other, go to another scripture. This is Revelation 17:10. The temple, just for anybody listening, that's 11:1 and 2. But Revelation 17:10 says, 5 is fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. And I understand there's a little difference in the scholarship and how people work this out, but most start with the 7 kings, starting with Julius Caesar, then Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, and Claudius, and then the one currently in power would be Nero. And again, while there are some differences, different views, a lot of people believe that Nero was, he would have been in power at that time, of certain at the earlier date, and he's a really good candidate, for the beast too, or one of the beasts. So that's another piece of internal evidence that seems to line up pretty specifically with the order of those kings or Caesars.
Josephus says that the first king was Julius Caesar, so he starts the count with him too. And if he did, and being a Jew, then John probably would have as well. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm. The other side of the coin, of course, is the time statements that are in Revelation, being that it's soon, that the time is at hand, and that how the book is bookended with that information. So I don't know why we miss it, and I don't know why we play so many games with those time statements. I know I played games with those time statements for a long time because I was ignorant, really. But I mean, wouldn't you agree? I mean, just saying that. First of all, it's writing to 7 churches that do not exist now. They're not here today. So the letters written to those churches now, again, with the verbal gymnastics, the mental gymnastics of trying to get these 7 churches to represent specific ages. And now we live in the Laodicean age and all this stuff. Thanks a lot, Schofield, and those other guys for writing that garbage. But the fact is,
they interpreted the Bible literally. I guess not. Huh?
It's funny how you have to turn that on and off. But for me, that was one of the kickers when I first heard it, was that, hey, look at the front and look at the back of Revelation and notice how this is shortly coming to pass. It's the time is here. It's now. And these churches are getting warned. This is a warning for them, what they were dealing with in that time. I don't know why it's so hard to see that, but because they say it's 96 AD, it forces the brain to come up with something else. It seems that's what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, why don't we go through the time text and go through some of these fanciful interpretations that people have given these Greek words and just
Sure.
kind of briefly refute them. Do you want to do that?
I love it.
Okay. I'll throw out one of the first ones. Well, you guys just don't understand. Soon, quickly, at hand, shortly, about to. That just means that Jesus is certainly going to come. Well, I think that is quickly refuted in Revelation 22:20, because he says, surely. Now, that's the Greek word nigh or nay, which does mean certainly. Okay. So it's surely or certainly I am coming quickly. Now, if quickly meant certainly, it would be certainly or surely I'm coming surely or certainly. And that would be redundant and it makes no sense. Right. So there are Greek words that John could have used if he
Hebrews used repetition. They use repetition for importance. That's what that means, dude. Come on.
I call that the Three Stooges interpretation. Certainly.
Just about all I got. Just about all of these are. I'll let someone else take another fanciful interpretation. If not, I'll keep going. So just let me know.
Well, one is the idea that when these things happen, which would be a lot of people think is our generation, they're going to happen just super fast, and then that's if you look up all the other passages that the comparing scripture with scripture, in all the other cases, that's not what it means. So that's another one that I've heard a lot. And the other thing is, if these things happen in the twinkling of an eye, isn't that pretty quick anyway? And so that kind of falls flat on both of those counts.
Well, Joel, let's develop that a little bit more. So this is Hal Lindsey's view, right? Since 1948, that's the super sign. So we're the terminal generation,
right?
And therefore, now that we're in the terminal generation, it really is going to happen soon. And so when they refer to soon, it means soon. So they're reading soon in Revelation going, okay, we're the terminal generation, so it's soon for us. But it wasn't soon for them. All right. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is Deuteronomy 32, verse 5 and verse 20 talks about Israel's last days terminal perverse and crooked generation. When that generation arrived in Israel's last days, then the appointed time of Israel's end would be near.
Right.
Jesus in Matthew 17:17 quotes that and says his generation was the perverse and crooked generation that Moses prophesied of. So Jesus is saying his generation is the terminal one. Acts 2:40, Peter says the same thing, quoting again Deuteronomy 32:5. He says, be saved. We need to be saved from this perverse and crooked generation. Where did Travis go? Is he here? Is he here?
He dropped out.
He'll be back.
He was with the kids or something.
He was rapping.
All right. Well, I'll keep going here in a second. So anyway, according to Jesus, according to Peter, and even according to Paul in Philippians 2, they all cite the terminal generation of Deuteronomy, and they say that their generation is the terminal last days generation. And that's why they say the end is near, because they're living in the terminal generation. Right. So what Hal Lindsey did is he hijacked the terminal generation away from Jesus and away from Peter and away from Paul and made it ours.
Yep.
And if that's not eisegesis, folks, I don't know what is.
And this gets you back to the timing that I mentioned earlier, that this is a covenantal lawsuit. Deuteronomy's wicked and perverse generation of 32 was to see what the covenant people's latter end would be. And Hebrews picks it up in 10:32, 31, 32 to 37, and picks up the idea of the days of vengeance, that their vengeance was coming shortly and it would not tarry. Revelation 6 and the fifth seal, the martyrs are crying out under the altar, how long until you bring that vengeance? Shortly and soon. If they're going to mess with the timing like that, then you've got to have a people that this is applicable to. And even futurist Christians agree that people does not exist. Therefore, you either got to reinstitute everything back in the future and bye-bye post-mill and all-mill cats.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep tracking on the false views of imminence, but I'll throw out another argument for the pre-AD 70 date that I've covered, is that in Revelation 1:7, he comes to judge the tribes of the land of Israel. Post AD 70, folks, you don't have tribes of Israel anymore. The
Right.
genealogical records were burned in AD 70. You can't prove what tribe you're from post AD 70.
God knows who they are, Mike. God knows who they are.
Oh, so that's how they're going to have.
If only John could have been specific and said something like, I don't know, even those who pierced him.
Yeah, I know. That's what I was just going to say.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So what are some other false views?
Yeah, but bro, you pierced them. Okay. You
Yeah.
pierced him. Have you ever been told that? I have.
Yeah.
We all pierced him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
One other thing I think is really powerful along these lines, it's Revelation 1:19, where it says, write down what you have seen, the things that are now happening, and the things that will happen. So if, in a futurist view, you'd have, because I don't think anybody could argue that verse is saying some of these things had already happened at that time. Some were happening right as John was writing, but now we're going to put a pause for a couple thousand years or so, and the rest of them will happen someday.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, Joel, that's really good, because I was responding to Doug Wilson in his debate with the non-millennialists in Revelation 10:11, and he kept talking about the already and the not yet. Well, Joel, you're hitting the nail on the head, because we have the inspired outline of the book in Revelation 1:19. It's about things in the past, about things of which are, there's your already. I mean, John's in the tribulation with them. That's your eschatological already. And then the things which are about to be fulfilled. There's your not yet. That's not a 2,000 plus years not yet. That's an about to be not yet. The prophecy of this book, singular, would be fulfilled shortly. There's no verses in there, Revelation 27 through 15, that are exempt from the timing of fulfillment at all.
Yeah, and you've got, and then I'll be quiet because I know I just chimed in again. But another thing that really hit me maybe a few months ago, but just in the first, few verses of Revelation, not only do we have the time statements there, but who have you got? You've got the Father, the Son, an angel. You've got an inspired apostle, and then the church who he used to give this to. And I'm thinking, so maybe you could say, well, maybe the people receiving it, maybe they missed something. Maybe they didn't quite get it. Well, maybe John quite got it. But so the angel, maybe they missed it. The Son missed it. And there's no way. And I think there's a reason that, that the Spirit has that there, because it's so strong from the Father all the way through the Son to an angel to inspired prophet. And so if somebody missed this, they all missed it. That means the Father also didn't know the appointed time, and you might as well sort of throw the whole thing out. I mean, maybe that sounds too strong, but that's the way I feel about it.
So I was, I'll say this: Eschatology Matters. I'm sure you guys are familiar with those. There was a pretty big name guy, post-millennial guy, that did a thing like, I don't know, 4 or 5 days ago on preterism. And I listened to it, and he specifically was talking about imminency in the book of Revelation. And he talked about how in verse 1, it says things that shortly come to pass. Verse 3, blessed are those that hear, this prophecy. And he's making the point that this is relevant to them. That those 7 churches were the ones that were going to hear this. And he said that, I typed this quote out because I thought this was good. And I'll get there. But he said it's kind of hard to argue that an audience of the first century would have read this, an audience that is in persecution, that they would have read this and said, oh, we're in the persecution now, but this has nothing to do with us. It's got to do with things that are going to happen between Israel and Iran in 2024. And I heard that and I thought, amen, that's spot on. But this same guy will take the book of Revelation and draw a big line in it at chapter 19, and the rest of it is still in our future. And my question is, if shortly, soon, et cetera, in chapter 1 was relevant to their audience, why is that not the case in chapter 22? It just seems like such an arbitrary division. And I guess these guys do this to fit their system. I mean, I don't know.
They see the train coming, so they have to make changes, and they have to read things into the text that just aren't there. I mean, that's the only explanation.
How long could we possibly make a generation in the Bible? So
apparently hundreds of years now.
yeah. I mean, I'm just
I think Jehovah's Witness have the record at this point. But
1914, right? That was theirs.
Right. They kind of started a little before everybody else.
Yeah, they really did. But that's what I was curious about, was because today's prophecy pundits are all about 1948. Will a nation be born in a day is the idea. They don't think about the 50 years leading up to that, that got it to that point. They don't even know what the Balfour Pact is. But regardless,
the church, apparently, because that's
yeah. Yep. So how long does it, what is a generation? We say 40 years. What could be the longest generation anybody could come up with?
Hebrews 3 and 4 ask the question, how long was God mad with that wicked generation? And he's talking about the generation in the wilderness.
Yes.
How long were they in the wilderness?
40 years.
Allah. The Bible tells you how long a generation is.
Exactly.
So the end. So we know that from the time of Christ's crucifixion to the removal of the sanctuary in the city was approximately around 40 years.
I think
Between 30 and 40 years is what Vines or Thayer's says.
Okay.
And that's about right. About the time that a man would have begin having his children in that culture would be about that time. He'd have his trade, and then he would. So between 35 and 40 years.
So does anyone know the argument for the late date? I saw, Zach, thank you. It was, it says Revelations were wrote in 96 during the time of Emperor Domitian. It was a scary way how you typed that. It looked like you were taking like a ransom note or something. But anyway, am I right? The only argument that anyone has for the late date is Emperor Domitian and
Irenaeus' statement.
Yeah.
Those are the main
That's
ones.
it. One, right? Just one statement. Is that correct?
It's just one statement, dude.
And going back, I think to Zach's comment earlier about the nature, being messed up, and because that's, at some point on my channel, I'm going to do something called the 4 last words of futurism. It hasn't happened yet, and because there's a misunderstanding of what it is, people will say, well, no matter what it says, no matter what the time statements are, because it hasn't happened yet, it must have been written, another time.
Do you want me to read Irenaeus' statement, or do you want to unpack that, or you just want to? Okay, this is.
I would like to hear that, because everybody that wants to point to the late date, let's just make sure that we all understand there is just one. Now he's close, of course. I believe it doesn't it descend from Polycarp. I think it.
Irenaeus is between AD 130 and 202.
Okay.
All right, and this is what he says in Book 5 of his Against Heresies. As these things are so, and this number 666 is found in all the approved and ancient copies, and those who saw John face to face confirm it. So the context is seeing John face to face. Let's point that out. Mm-hmm. And reason teaches us that the number of the name of the beast, according to the mode of calculation among the Greeks, appears in its letters. We will not, however, incur the risk for pronouncing positively as to the name of the Antichrist. Man, this guy's theology is totally whacked. He's talking about the Antichrist making the same connection. That's horrible. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him. Again, now we're getting down to the immediate context as to what it is that John is seeing here, or who is being seen. Announced by him, that's John, who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For, and here's the debate, is it he, John, that is seen? Or is it the revelation John had, or John was seeing the revelation not very long time since, but in our day toward the end of Domitian's reign, unquote. So the debate is it John that was seen during the time of Domitian? Which makes sense because he lived past AD 70, according to John 21 or 22. When Peter's like, what about him? Is he going to be alive till you come? He says, don't worry about it, implying basically that he would. So and this breaks down. If you look at the context, if you look at the grammar, Irenaeus' writings in other places, this is one of his favorite phrases. And when he uses it, it's always referring to a person that is being seen. So you have the context, you have the grammar. It all points to the fact that John is the person that was seen during the time of Domitian, which proves our case. But they want to say, Rick, that, well, John saw he was given the apocalyptic vision and he saw it during the time of Domitian's reign. So it's a horrible argument, and they hang everything just about on this. and they claim that there was some kind of Christian persecution under Domitian. But we have all kinds of premillennials that are now admitting we can't find historically where Domitian had this intense persecution of Christians.
No, I
We
looked.
have all
I
over the place.
searched. I was searching for it because I thought, well, obviously this happened during the time of Domitian, but we already know, historically speaking, that Caesar Nero, that he set fire to Rome, and then he blamed the Christians for it, and a severe persecution of over 4 years came.
What
And
year is that? 64?
64 to 68.
Yep, 3.5 years, just like Joel was talking about, Revelation 13 and Revelation 17. He would wage war against the saints for 3.5 years.
And I think that there was another persecution under Emperor Trajan, but that has nothing to do with what's going on here. Because again, if we're going to use, Irenaeus' quote, it's Domitian. Now, you've also heard that Irenaeus thought that Jesus was 50 years old. He also says that in that same book. Okay, we know that Jesus was not 50. So it's not that Irenaeus couldn't be wrong. He could.
And that his
But to
ministry
me-
lasted 15 years.
What's that?
And that his ministry lasted 15 years.
Precisely. So he can be wrong, but not to do away with Irenaeus completely, but the idea that one single quote is what this is all, that's the giant linchpin here.
Yeah.
And the internal evidence seems to really far outweigh it. And I have a book by Ken Gentry called When Jerusalem Fell. And I can't find it. It's around here somewhere. I was digging through it. Sorry. It's definitely it's a good read because it's an early date book. He really
There we
shows
go.
There it is. That's it.
400 some
great book.
pages talking about the early days.
Fantastic book.
Yes.
There's another thing too, is that and even R.C. Sproul, who I will happily admit probably had a brain a little bit better than mine. I mean, he said this was a very confusing quote and wasn't even sure what it meant. But there's Revelation 10:11 says, "Then I was told you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, languages, and kings." And this is a quote from Jerome, who's another early church father, and he noted that John was seen in AD 96. And that John was so old and infirm, he had to be carried to the church and could only speak a few words to the people. And then the quote goes on, "Are we to believe that John, so close to death, was then to prophesy again concerning many peoples and nations and tongues and kings? It's difficult to imagine he would be able to speak to many nations and many kings at the date after AD 96 if he could barely get a few words out to one church." So, that's interesting too.
Well, and I'm glad that you said it because everybody's been saying John, like the Apostle John. Now, is it agreed in all of Orthodoxy that it's John the Apostle that wrote this book?
Where are you going, son?
The answer is no, because we know
I-
some people that say John the Elder. This is within Orthodoxy. I'm just saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Whoever it is, it's clearly the same person that wrote the Gospel of John, because there's a chiastic it's just like the book of Acts is designed to be read right after Luke's Gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Right after reading John's Gospel, you should be reading Revelation. And Warren Gage is an excellent Reformed guy who develops that. And he shows how there's just this perfect, beautiful harmony of themes and structures between the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation. So it's the same author. I don't care who you say it is. It's the same one would be my
Right. And that's fine. I'm just saying that within Orthodoxy, that some would consider John the Elder, which is not John the Apostle, as the writer of these books, or at least Revelation. I don't know. I'm not making a call in that regard. I would agree that the writer of John and Revelation are the same author. I'll say that.
Yeah.
Why do some people think it's not John the Apostle? Why do they think it's somebody else?
Why?
Yeah, people have never heard this. Why? Yeah, I mean, why do some people think that the author is not John the Apostle, but they think that it's?
I know that someone named Rick Welch had a series on that on a podcast where he talked about some of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I've went through several different studies, and I can't come to perfect conclusions about everything, but to me, the evidence within Revelation itself, to me, tells me all that I need to know about when it was written and what it was written for and to whom it was written. I don't need to have a late date seems ludicrous. And because of that late date, people hold on to that, which is going to bring me to the next topic I want to ask you guys about. Guys, I grew up in an atheist home. By the time I was 10, I became a believer. And then from the time I was 10 until about 3 years ago, I was a dispensational wackadoo that was always worried about what's going to happen in my world. Now, this book by Frank Gumerlock, I don't know if you guys have ever read this book. You can see how thick it is. From the first century all the way to today, the church has been making these claims over and over and over.
Newspaper eschatology has been going on for a long time.
Yeah, it has. So worrying about whenever he's going to come. But I wanted to know, for each of you personally, if you'd be willing just to give a few minutes to talk about your relationship to this book of Revelation. For me, it was always like a scary book. Before I read the Bible, I was reading Revelation because that was the most interesting book. That should have been the last book I ever read out of the Bible. But I tried to figure it out. I tried to read other people like Hal Lindsey and David Jeremiah, you name it, across the board, these people that write prophecy books, to try to understand it. And every time I closed a book, I walked away completely hopeless because I thought, who could ever figure this out? And always wondering, when my kids were born, guys, look, Zach and Travis, you guys have young children. Joel, you have young children. So do you, Mike, kids that are at home. All my kids are grown now, but when my kids were little, guys, I was terrified. I thought the end of the world's coming. We've got, Y2K. Oh, here we go. There was always something happening. And there's something going on right now. People are talking the Glenn Beck, Tucker Carlson. Now we have Gog and Magog, guys. Now it's finally arrived. It's like, oh, more of this. And it keeps people so messed up and so worried. Do you guys have a similar kind of story? Or what was your relationship to Revelation prior to becoming a preterist?
I met Nikolai Carpathia in about the 5th grade. So,
oh, wow. So you read that series?
No, we watched it in Sunday school class.
Oh.
We watched the old movies. I don't know that I really had a relationship with it as far as, younger and growing up. I probably didn't give it much thought. And even in my studies to preterism, it really didn't start in Revelation. Mine was in the prophets and some other things. And I remember one of my hangups being with it, though, as far as not even full preterism, but partial preterism, and specifically what the post-millennials were doing and making so much of it in the past, was just the way that the wording would be used. And that was a hang up to me to get to where I was. And I tell people this all the time. Somehow or another, I got tossed into the eschatology world, but it was never really about eschatology. This whole thing was about hermeneutics and the way you interpreted the Bible. So I can remember coming from a premill mindset and saying, well, how am I going to look at the book of Revelation and all this stuff is going to be symbolic? Well, that's overwhelming to think about. And even though the premills do it in a far different way than we do, but my relationship with it has been slow, because now I can look at, hey, there's locusts in Revelation 8 and 9. Oh, there's locusts that are coming as armies all over the Old Testament, specifically back in Joel chapter 2. Hey, there's grass that's getting burned up here somewhere down the end. Oh, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 6 to 8. All flesh is like grass. Oh, there's trees that aren't harmed. Oh, Psalm 1, blessed is the man, he's like a tree planted by rivers of water that's upright. So really, interpreting scripture helped me even be interested in the book of Revelation, because it was such a put off to me that I didn't have any clue to begin with. So,
did the ghost
you-
Doug
you-
Wilson
you
just jump
don't-
in here?
What happened to you, buddy?
Sorry. I had Bible Gateway open to look at a verse earlier, and this ad came on. We're still selling mattresses.
I've noticed that they are really have those ads that just play randomly now.
I thought the first
Joel's
thing I better do is just bam and just mute everything and then figure out what that is.
Sorry about that, Zach.
that's okay. I think I finished what I wanted to say in that, though.
Anybody else?
I'll just tell you my experience. I didn't didn't grow up in the church world and didn't know squat really about any of this stuff. And my first study, we were at the local mega church here down the road from where we live now, and he went verse by verse through the book of Revelation on Wednesday nights, premillennial dispensationalism, I mean, to the T. And I remember finishing that, and then obviously I had this thought every week, but I was just really confused. And I thought, none of this makes any sense. It sounds like the plot of a Star Trek movie or something. I didn't get any of it. And really, that was the only interaction I had with any of this until this knothead in the middle here and myself, we decided to look into some of these other views we knew existed. Didn't know anything about them at the time. And fast forward, and obviously you see where we wound up. But I agree with Zach. The book of Revelation had very, very little to do with my coming to the preterist view. To be honest with you, I haven't gone through it verse by verse since becoming a preterist. And so I'm really excited about what we're doing here. I think it's an important book. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there, but it didn't have that effect on me. Eschatology as a whole really, really didn't have that effect on me like it did a lot of folks.
You want me to do that?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mike. You hit it.
You can only read the chat, people.
Okay. So I grew up in Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, or Santa Ana. So I grew up under Pastor Chuck Smith and a big mega church there. And of course, he was getting his theology from Hal Lindsey. So I kind of grew up going to that Christian school there at the church as well. Grew up hearing this all the time, being younger, that the rapture was going to happen in 1981. That didn't happen. Then the Lord saved me in 1986. So there was this hope that 1988 would be it, because that's exactly 40 years from 1948. And I just remember being plagued by it, man. I'd even go to afterglow services where the gifts of the Spirit were allowed to operate. And you'd have some lady or some guy stand up. Someone would speak in quote unquote tongues, which was just a bunch of gibberish. And then an interpreter would stand up, quote unquote, and say, "My little flock, I'm coming for you soon." And I'm thinking, there's nothing, number one, there's nothing miraculous about that. But number two, just the manipulation there, because now the Holy Spirit is supposed to be confirming this newspaper eschatology through a prophet and through miracles. And it's just a big, big mess when you enter in the charismatic stuff with these things, because these guys really think that they're prophets. And so I thought, man, this really blows, because I want to get married. I want to go to college. I want to start a family. And then it was kind of a guilt trip, like, oh, well, Jesus isn't enough. I want these carnal things, right? I mean, I want to be with Jesus in the rapture. And it didn't sit well. Then I went to Bible college, had classes on expository preaching, hermeneutics, homiletics. And I came back after I graduated, and I'd watch Pastor Chuck Smith during the New Year's updates, the prophecy updates. And he would just read something out of Revelation, and he would just read something out of the Olivet Discourse. And the rest of the sermon, if you could call it that, or message, was just all about what was taking place in the newspapers and current events. And I remember one time, I was there for this. I don't know if you guys remember, Gorbachev had a big, mole, not a mole, but some kind of birthmark or something on his forehead, right?
The mark of the beast.
I was there when he said, "We think that we can see 666 in there." Yeah. And everybody, he wasn't expecting this. Everyone started laughing. And then he started laughing with it. But that's how bizarre the church that I was in, I mean, that's all this thing was. This was their entire life. This was their secret sauce to growing Calvary Chapels nationwide, just like Jehovah's Witnesses, just like Mormonism. It's just like Seventh-day Adventists. It's always this newspaper eschatology that drives in even non-believers, because even non-believers are interested about the end of the world and prophecy. And it produces false converts as well.
Yeah. I'm more along the lines of Rick and Mike. I mean, my first church I was a part of was a Calvary Chapel church, and so I got the stuff all the time. And I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I'm the kind of person where I tend to be pretty committed to whatever is in front of me right at the time. And so, yeah, Hal Lindsey's already been mentioned, Left Behind series, Jack Van Impe and Rexel, maybe a couple of you guys are too young for them, but I mean, I was all over this stuff. And it's been mentioned already too, that Revelation being John's Olivet Discourse, but I don't remember which. I was reading a book or listening to somebody that said that. This is probably like 3 years ago now, maybe 4 years ago. And that blew me away, made a lot of sense. But I wasn't so like, I literally have one friend who had to, like, was so disturbed by all this, was a dispensationalist. He was like between the ages of 16 and 17, he was checked into like a psych clinic, because and you do hear stories about that. I'm not saying they're normative, but this really freaks people out. I wasn't like that, but I would say the biggest problem for me in terms of how to live as a Christian is I did believe this whole world was bad, evil, wicked, because every time I read the Bible and saw wicked generation, perverse generation, it was always right now. And I couldn't kind of wait to get out of here, and everything's horrible and everything's falling apart. And because of that, I don't think I was very fruitful as a believer in a lot of ways. I wasn't probably helping a lot of other people. And that's one of the big problems. God creates a world that he says is good, but we're thinking, the whole thing is just wicked and worthless, and it's all going to hell. And it does affect how we live. So that's a big part of it for me.
Well said,
that Calvary Chapel group, is that where Greg Laurie is from?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So he's still putting this kind of stuff out. I remember
He's still
reading
regurgitating
constantly.
And John Corson can't, you were talking about how long is a generation? Well, they were saying it was 40 years minus 7 years for the rapture, 1981. And then, well, maybe we got it wrong. 1988, 40 years. Well, then John Corson came along and he says, well, maybe it's 55, and then some others said 70. And then, Dave Hunt comes along and says, here, hold my beer, and says it's 100. And like Zach said, Zach gave you what the scripture tells you the definition of a generation is. You don't have to go beyond what is written to understand what it is.
Now, Zach, the way that you define this as a covenantal judgment from Leviticus 26, now, do you see dispensationalists or futurists that are doing this prophecy type talk? Are they defining it as a covenantal judgment today?
I think they see some significance to Israel back in it, which is why they rebuild this thing. But no, they view it super global as to where we would see it as local.
Right. So if it's, I'm glad you said local, because everything in this is local. It's all everything about, whether it's the Olivet Discourse, flee to the mountains of Judea, or if you're talking about what's happening with, it's obviously local.
But the language is the problem. Just like Mike said a while ago in Revelation 1:7, he's coming on the clouds, every eye will see him, even they who pierced him, all the tribes of the earth. Well, there you go. It says earth. And they don't know that it's gay. And they don't know that you can go back to Malachi chapter 4. And in Malachi 4, if you read in the ESV, John the Baptist, the messenger's predictions would come upon the covenant land. The Elijah would predict a judgment on the covenant land. That's Matthew chapter 3. It's the Hebrew word eretz. The Septuagint translates it as ges. It's the covenant land. That's John the Baptist predictions in Matthew 3, which are the same covenantal judgments of Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy 28, 27, and 28. All of those things are laid out. So go to Revelation chapter 6, and you can see the plagues that are laid out in Leviticus 26. But there's a misunderstanding of global events here. There's a misunderstanding of the context at large, and it's because they remove it from the covenant lawsuit. Take Revelation 18, Rick. Revelation 18, starting like verse 21, go down to the end of it. It says that the sound of the bride and bridegroom would be heard in her no longer. There's only one person in the Bible. You got two options here, okay? You're either fixing to blast the church as Babylon the harlot, or you're going to say it's Old Covenant Israel. Oh, by the way, who all over the Old Testament, the faithful city has become a harlot. Ezekiel 16, yep. She plays the harlot with many lovers. She's doing the same thing in Revelation 18. They're removing this because they don't understand the language. That's why I said you don't come to these conclusions just by thinking in eschatological terms. This is a hermeneutical approach. How are you going to interpret the text? And all of us went down that route, and how we interpreted certain text built us to our position. We didn't start with a position and force text into it. We dealt with individual text, and it pieced together to form this. Well, that's
Exactly.
true for me anyway. I can't speak for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and before we close, I was going to say that when Jesus was at the temple, when he's talking to the Pharisees, he tells them that they're going to fill up the wrath, right? They're going to fill up the wrath against them, from righteous Abel to Zechariah, son of Berechiah. And that he himself, that Christ was going to send to them more prophets and more wise men and scribes. And so we know that Paul being a scribe, Silvanus or Silas, Timothy, these men, Peter, all of these men who are, whether it's prophecy or they're writing these books, they're persecuted. The Jews of Thessalonica, for example, follow Paul and Silas to Berea. We see them persecuting from city to city. Jesus is talking to that specific generation that's in front of him in Jerusalem. And then he cries out, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, those that stonest the prophets," right? So just looking at that before you even get to the Olivet Discourse, it becomes very, very obvious to me that everything that's about to take place on them and what he's bringing into the world is all about that time and that people in that moment. And so I don't even know how I made the mistake, other than I was just taught, how I made the mistake to turn all that stuff off and put it in my future. But I know it was debilitating for me. Debilitating. Because although, like, I'll say this like on the Burros of Berea, Sarita talks about this with me quite often. She was raised Southern Baptist, but never heard anything that I've been describing. I was just a few miles up the road, and it was like every day we were hearing this. So that's one of the things that I want to do in this study is I want to get down to the brass tacks of that covenantal judgment and walk through this. I want to keep sincere with the time texts. I want to take as much as we can from the Old Testament so that we understand the symbology and what's being done. Any of the structures, like you said, chiastic structure from John to Revelation, Mike.
Recapitulation.
Or recapitulation, all of these things that to help me and also the audience that's listening see how the Lord dealt with this people and how he brought in the New Jerusalem and the new heaven and the new earth that we have today, and what that means for us and our worldview now. Because we can't, frankly, it scares me what some of these people are saying today. I guess it always has been this way, but especially now, I see the younger generation sort of buying into this even more, and it's really sad.
This is a little bit. This might be a little bit crude, but it popped into my head at one point. But it's what you were talking about, Rick, where I'm kind of paraphrasing what you said in my own words, but where if you divorce the book of Revelation from its original context and those people that were actually guilty of those crimes, it would be kind of like as a dad, and I'm sitting around with my children and they've been really disobedient. And I'm telling them, so you've done this and you've done this and you've done this, but don't worry, I'm going to spank another generation 2,000 years later.
Right. Yeah. As soon as the grandchild's born, you start smacking the grandkid for what the dad did. Yeah. It's kind of bizarre.
Well, Rick, something that you mentioned there is, or alluded to, is just the fact that theology does have consequences. Mm-hmm. It really does. What we believe affects what we do. And I think that this is one of those areas, especially you mentioned the younger generation coming up. I think it's very important for us now to do the things like we're doing to get an alternative message out there than the one that the mainstream is pumping out. I remember when Zach and I were on this journey, listening to Jeff Durbin's Matthew 24 deal, and he talked about how Lindsay, and all this is before me, I don't remember any of this, but he talked about how people were like cashing in their 401ks. They weren't going to college. They weren't having children, selling all their stuff because they thought they were going to get raptured out of there, and this caused devastation for a generation of people because they believed a lie that was being propagated by the mass church. And I say all that to say that you're absolutely right. And what we believe matters. This can do a lot of damage to people. And so again, it's important. And if you're listening to this and you've never heard any of this stuff we're saying, like, research this yourself. Don't just believe what somebody tells you. Zach and I tell people all the time, don't believe it just because we said it. You know what I mean? Go search this stuff out. Seek the truth, because there are other messages out there, and you discern which one's right.
Yeah. And this,
sorry, go ahead, Mike.
This is the unveiling, the revelation of Jesus Christ. This book was never intended to be confusing, right? It's the unveiling of Christ. If you understand what the theme is, the time frame, imminence, the genre, apocalyptic language, why would we literalize a vision? If you keep these things front and center, you will be able to understand the book of Revelation. And it's going to be very exciting for you that are listening, because I know when I came to preterism, I was just so filled with joy, because now I could really understand this.
Yeah.
You know, it's the revealing of Christ. This is not about telling you about nuclear developments with Iran and Iraq and Korea and the United States. And because a dragon is mentioned, it must be China. And because there's wings coming out, that must be an eagle, because now United States is in there. All that is just, once you see the beauty of the covenantal structure, and you see that Christ is forefront in this book, and that it is unveiling who Christ is and who his church is in him, then you can really find joy, and you can really find clarity.
Absolutely. And Mike, I know you didn't tell me to do this, but I wanted to show everybody on here. This book, you guys can get it at fullpreterism.com. And that's the new cover, which is pretty snazzy, isn't it? I really like that cover. But the eschatology of Islam and Zionism, a biblical response. It's a great book, and it's the world we live in right now. We're watching what's going on in Israel. We're constantly concerned about what's going on with Islam and all of this. I'm hoping that through this study that we can really begin to understand what Jesus is revealing to us in regard to that old covenant Israel. So we can really get an understanding of that, so we can see where we really are today. And I did the same thing, Mike. When I finally saw it, I was like, the world is actually a place that we need to get busy helping. We need to really get to work. We have a lot to do.
A lot of this will be clarified. And I know Zach, I think, has been doing a study on this, on the rewards of the church. Once we look at what the rewards are of the church connected to the soon coming of Christ, the nature and the beauty of who Christ really is and the glory of his kingdom, that's just going to be unfolded. And it's going to be awesome.
Does anybody have any final thoughts before we stop this first episode here?
Yeah, just one more thing. You know, how we read the Bible reveals a lot about, what we believe. I think the clothes that we wear reveal a lot about us too. So I need to ask Mike, are you wearing suspenders?
No, man. No.
Okay, I just checking.
I'm curious, Zach, are you wearing a Burroughs hoodie?
Man, I am.
I represent.
That's awesome.
I love it. That's good. By the way, have you guys ever seen a super bomb?
No.
Now I have.
Yeah. My
Wow.
company's name is Acme, so one of the guys made me that. It's a super bomb from Acme.
That's funny.
How much is
This
one of
is-
those?
Yeah.
We're
So-
going to blow up the futurist
There we
presupposition.
go. There we go.
I really
This is-
appreciate you guys taking the time out on a Sunday afternoon to talk with me. And I'm looking forward to doing this and learning from each one of you. And I hope that our listeners will go and follow each of these guys, go to their Patreon, go to their YouTube channels, like, subscribe, follow their content, share the content. It'll be out on the Burrows much later, but you guys can go to those places and find this. Obviously, if you're seeing it, you're on it, but tell your friends about it too. Okay. Let them know that we're doing this study, and share it around and bring more people to it. And let's get talking about it.
Amen.
Good stuff. Thanks for having me, Rick.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Zach,
Thank you.
all of you guys. And we'll talk to you next time.
All right. Take care, guys.
Bye
Take
for
care.
now.